In the courtroom could be sliced with a knife. Reporters sat edge of seat, pens hovering above notepads, waiting, aching for the first word. Then the doors creaked open. A hush swept the room. And in stepped the man who held the answers the entire nation had been speculating about. The lead FBI agent who oversaw the raid on Sean Diddy Combs' private residence. He wasn't a celebrity. He didn't speak like a showman. But as he made his way to the witness stand, the entire courtroom leaned in. Because they knew this wasn't rumor. This wasn't theory. This was federal truth. The judge nodded. The prosecutor approached, voice steady but brimming with weight. Agent Monroe, he began, please describe to the court what you found inside the hidden vault located in Mr. Combs' Beverly Hills property. For a moment, the agent simply stared ahead. The silence was deafening. Then he spoke, each word landing like a slow drum beat. The vault was concealed behind a false wall in the lower level of the home. Access required biometric clearance. Not even the house staff were aware of its existence. The room reacted with a ripple of gas and widened eyes. Diddy's legal team shifted uncomfortably. Diddy himself sat stone-faced, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles turned white. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it, Agent Monroe continued, pulling no punches. Once inside, we found an extensive archive, digital and physical, labeled compartments, encrypted drives, dozens of classified folders with initials and dates. But what stood out most was the pattern. The prosecutor leaned forward. What kind of pattern, Agent? Monroe took a deep breath. There was an entire section labeled Assets. Inside were files containing images, contracts, correspondence, some going back over 20 years. These weren't just business records. These were leverage files, blackmail materials, personal secrets, audio and video footage. In some cases, confessions, recorded, transcribed, stored with timestamps. Shock vibrated through the room like a low, ominous chord. People glanced at one another, their expressions asking the same silent question. How long had this been happening? Monroe's voice hardened. We also discovered a private log, handwritten, detailed. It referenced individuals, famous names, lesser-known insiders, next to notes like paid, compliant, still useful, or waiting for the right time. It was not the kind of document kept by someone protecting memories. It was kept by someone managing power. A woman in the gallery audibly gasped. The judge raised his gavel but hesitated, sensing the weight of what was unraveling. And there was more, Monroe said. A room within the vault, locked with a separate passcode. Inside, we found a safe. We have only begun processing the contents, but what I can say is this. The vault wasn't a panic room. It was a control room. With that final word, the courtroom fell into stunned stillness. No objections, no noise. Just the unbearable gravity of what had been revealed. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom remained frozen in disbelief. Even seasoned journalists, used to high-profile scandals and headline-grabbing trials, sat stiff in their seats, visibly shaken by the calm but devastating revelations coming from the witness stand. Agent Monroe adjusted his suit, then leaned slightly closer to the microphone. The next words out of his mouth would take the case and the room to a darker place. Among the encrypted drives, he said, our digital forensics team discovered a folder titled Pending Insurance, Level Red. The prosecutor blinked. Level Red? Monroe nodded. According to internal FBI classification, the tag indicates material of the highest sensitivity, either containing evidence of criminal coercion, national-level relevance, or potential threats to life or safety. In this context, it seemed to be Diddy's personal failsafe. People in the gallery were visibly rattled. A woman clutched her chest. A man whispered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Inside that folder, Monroe explained, were dozens of files, video clips, untraceable wire transactions, hidden audio captures, and even what appeared to be falsified documents designed to incriminate or destroy individuals if released. This wasn't insurance, Monroe said flatly. It was extortion in preparation. The prosecutor asked for clarification, and the agent responded without pause. For example, one clip showed a recording of a famous industry executive speaking candidly at what seemed to be a private retreat. There were personal confessions, unfiltered conversations, but the most disturbing part? The timestamps. The device used to record the clip was linked to surveillance equipment found in one of Diddy's guest homes. You could feel the breath drain from the room. These individuals had no idea they were being recorded, Monroe added, and the content was kept with metadata logs tracking their careers, contracts, and public behavior. It was a system of control. If anyone turned on him, Diddy had preloaded ammunition. Diddy sat motionless at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed forward, but his face beginning to crack under the pressure. His lead attorney scribbled furiously on a notepad. It was clear they hadn't expected this level of detail, this level of federal certainty. Agent Monroe wasn't finished. There were also physical items in the vault, unmarked cash bundles, high-value assets like bearer bonds, and, most concerning, multiple passports under aliases, some issued years apart, all used, all stamped. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly disturbed but maintaining composure. The jury, meanwhile, was visibly shaken. One juror's leg bounced nervously under their seat. Another sat with their hand over their mouth, eyes wide. And then, Monroe said, "We found a list." He pulled out a printed copy from his file, offering it to the court. It was a roster, celebrities, politicians, media figures. Next to each name were categories: owned, owed, watch, and target. Some names had dates. Others had annotations that, frankly, we're still trying to decode. The prosecutor looked stunned. "Agent Monroe, are you telling this court that the defendant maintained a running inventory of people under his influence?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation, and he referred to it as his vault index. A new wave of murmurs broke out across the courtroom. The judge finally struck the gavel, once sharply. "Order." But the damage was done. The truth was out. This wasn't just a vault filled with secrets, Monroe concluded. It was a centralized operation. Years of leverage, intimidation, and strategic manipulation. Collected, filed, and waiting. It's the most sophisticated personal archive of coercion I've seen in my 24 years at the Bureau. And with that, the courtroom sat in stunned silence once again, the sound of the truth louder than any word spoken after. The world had just glimpsed the skeletons behind the fame, and those skeletons were now dancing in daylight. The air had thickened in the courtroom, not with noise or chaos, but with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against every wall, every chest, every breath. Agent Monroe remained composed, but there was something colder now in his voice, like even he hadn't fully processed the enormity of what they had uncovered inside Diddy's private vault. "Let's talk about the recordings," he said. "There were hundreds." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Hundreds?" Monroe nodded solemnly. "Carefully categorized, indexed by year, location, and subject. Most were audio, some were video, and nearly all were obtained without the knowledge of the people involved." The court shifted again. This was no longer just about power. It was about surveillance, psychological warfare, a legacy not built on talent alone, but on shadows and silence. One file in particular stood out, Monroe continued. It was labeled Fallback Asset DJ.ny.conf. It was an hour-long conversation. The subject was under the influence. He shared stories, personal experiences, industry secrets, even legal vulnerabilities. And at one point he said, "If Puff ever turns on me, I'm done. He's got everything." Murmurs rippled across the room. The implication wasn't just fear, it was total submission. The suggestion that Diddy had people trapped under invisible chains. "And that's the theme," Monroe said. "Each file wasn't just dirt, it was insurance. Not for legal defense, but to guarantee silence, loyalty, or compliance." In one clip, an emerging artist begged to renegotiate a deal. The conversation was calm until Diddy said, "You want freedom? I've got a video of you from Vegas. Keep dreaming." The artist went silent. The prosecutor looked visibly disturbed. "Were there minors involved in any of this?" "We are still investigating," Monroe answered carefully. "There are files we haven't decrypted yet. But what we've found so far already paints a horrifying picture of manipulation and long-term coercion. Contracts rewritten under pressure, collaborations forced, careers destroyed by a whisper." A journalist at the back wiped tears from her eyes. One juror visibly turned pale. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was corrosive. The agent pulled out a physical item from the evidence folder. It was a small, cracked USB drive, its plastic casing scorched on one side, as if someone had tried to destroy it. This drive was recovered from a hidden panel behind the vault's main storage wall. It had been burned partially. Our forensics team was able to extract 2 video files from it. One of them is now under seal due to its extreme graphic and criminal nature. The other is a private meeting with 2 industry heads, one of whom is still active today. Monroe stared directly at the jury. They weren't talking about music. They were talking about people. Who to push forward, who to blacklist, who to keep in line. Diddy, off camera but audible, is heard saying, "Don't worry, I've got tapes on all of them. They move when I say move." The room didn't gasp this time. They couldn't. It was beyond shock now. It was grief for an industry so many believed in. A realization that so much of what glittered had been manufactured in darkness. Monroe set the USB drive down gently. There's a reason people don't speak out. This vault explains it. For decades, people wondered why certain artists disappeared, why deals fell apart, why executives backed down when they had the upper hand. This is why. They weren't afraid of losing. They were afraid of exposure. He looked toward Diddy's defense table. And every piece of evidence we've presented so far, every video, every transcript, every coded message, points back to one orchestrator, Mr. Combs. Diddy didn't flinch. He stared at the table in front of him, as if absorbing the reality of the fortress he had built, and the wreckage now left behind. Agent Monroe closed the file, his voice steady but final. The vault wasn't just hidden behind walls, it was hidden in plain sight. Inside the smiles, the contracts, the headlines. And now that it's open, the truth can't be locked away again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of a legacy falling apart, brick by brick. As the courtroom struggled to absorb what had already been revealed, Agent Monroe cleared his throat, signaling that what was coming next would be even more difficult to hear. Every person in that room instinctively straightened up. The energy shifted, darker now, as if the walls themselves knew the truth was about to take a more sinister turn. "There's another section of the vault," Monroe said, his voice quieter but more focused, "that we're calling the archive room." It was behind a biometric lock, completely separate from the main storage. The door was disguised behind an audio panel in the studio. It required retinal scan access. Only one match opened it, Sean Combs. The judge leaned forward. The gallery was breathless. "Inside that archive room," Monroe continued, "were what we believe to be the most sensitive and protected materials in the entire estate. Multiple hard drives were mounted into the walls themselves, physically welded. These weren't just backup drives. They were surveillance archives, over 60 terabytes of footage. Dozens of body cams, drone footage, hidden camera angles from inside Diddy's own properties, and those of others." Several jurors physically recoiled. "These weren't home security recordings," Monroe clarified. "They were personalized, targeted captures. One folder was labeled Guest Risk Tier A. Inside, we found raw, unedited footage of high-profile individuals inside private rooms, unaware they were being filmed." People in the gallery were now openly disturbed. Some covered their faces. Others shook their heads, stunned into disbelief. "And that wasn't all," Monroe added grimly. "Another folder was labeled Handlers. It contained scripts. Yes, actual written scripts, with conversation guides, manipulation tactics, and behavioral notes. These were instructions for how to extract favors, loyalty, or silence from specific individuals. In many cases, they were connected to artists under contract or people with criminal exposure." He paused to let the information settle. No one said a word. One document stood out, he said. It was titled Phase 4, Collapse Protocol. It contained contingency plans. If Diddy were ever investigated, or arrested, or killed, these plans detailed exactly what media narratives to trigger, what backup files to release anonymously, and how to turn allies into shields. The prosecutor interjected gently. "To clarify, these weren't paranoid ramblings?" "No," Monroe answered. "They were structured, professional, and, according to our behavioral analysts, crafted with precision. Whoever helped him write these had intelligence or psychological training. These weren't just about survival. They were about counterattack." The courtroom trembled with an eerie stillness. Another file, Legacy Re-Edit, listed specific journalists, PR firms, and platforms. There were payment records, shell company invoices, and notes detailing which stories to push, which reporters to groom, and which platforms to avoid. The judge exhaled slowly, trying not to let personal reactions show, but failing just slightly. It was impossible to hear this and remain unaffected. Agent Monroe looked at the jury once more. "Let me be clear. This wasn't the work of a man trying to protect his brand. This was the work of someone who believed their power made them untouchable. Someone who didn't trust anyone, not even his own circle, and who built an empire on surveillance, silence, and sabotage." His voice dropped a level. "And then there was the envelope." Gasps returned like a wave. It was sealed, handwritten on the front, "For my eyes only, B." Inside was a single memory card. What's on that card is currently under restricted review by federal authorities. But I will say this, it has already triggered new investigations, and what it contains may redefine everything we thought we knew, not just about Mr. Combs, but about a portion of the industry itself. No one moved. No one breathed. It was no longer about celebrity. It was no longer about music. This was about control, how it's built, how it's hidden, and how it destroys everything in its shadow. And for the first time in the trial, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a crime scene. The room was cold now, not from the air conditioning, but from something deeper, something spiritual. It was the kind of cold that comes when you hear something you can never unhear, when truth roars louder than denial, and you begin to understand the true cost of silence. Agent Monroe sat back slightly, giving the court a moment to breathe. Not that anyone actually could. Then he leaned in again. Among the most alarming discoveries, he said, were the financial records tied to the vault. He tapped on the stack of documents before him. These weren't just bank statements. They were coded ledgers, internal records with layers of aliases, offshore transfers, digital wallets, and shell companies. Some traced to luxury property deals, others to discrete settlements, and a few to unidentified cash withdrawals of enormous value. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. Were these settlements related to any of the alleged victims mentioned in the files? Yes, Monroe confirmed. Many were, and several were made through third-party intermediaries. There was a pattern of payments issued shortly after threats were made, or after certain individuals were captured on secret footage. He paused as the tension in the room rose again. In one specific case, he continued, an individual received $2.1 million through a company registered in Malta, 4 days after what appears to be a forced NDA signing. That same person was later listed under Diddy's watch category with the note, stable. Don't agitate. The court murmured in disbelief. The judge raised a hand for silence, but even he looked shaken. And then, Monroe said, lowering his voice, we found the briefing books. Heads turned sharply. These were physical binders, leather-bound, dozens of them, each one labeled by year and quarter, like quarterly strategy updates. But they weren't for business. They were psychological profiles. The jurors leaned in again, almost afraid to blink. Each book detailed high-profile figures, music producers, managers, influencers, athletes. The files included their vulnerabilities, past addictions, affairs, debt issues, even mental health struggles. Most shockingly, some of this data could only have been obtained through illegal means. Medical files, therapy notes, private call logs. One woman in the audience audibly gasped. Everything, Monroe said, was cataloged like inventory. The binders weren't meant to protect Diddy. They were designed to dismantle others. The prosecutor swallowed hard. Agent Monroe, did you find any evidence of blackmail actively being carried out? Yes, Monroe replied. Multiple communications. In one email chain, Diddy's assistant was instructed to remind a former partner that certain footage would be unfortunate to resurface, especially now that the partner was negotiating a new record deal. The jury was pale. The press had stopped writing. They were just listening now, listening to the sound of an empire built on silence, collapsing brick by brick. But that's not all, Monroe said, eyes sharp. We discovered something else inside the vault, a document labeled New Blood Initiative. The prosecutor looked confused. What does that mean? Monroe flipped through the file and pulled out a photograph, one he didn't show, but described. It's a recruitment program, targeting younger, vulnerable artists, mostly aspiring rappers and dancers. Promises of fast fame, private parties, unrecorded meetings. And then, silence. Each person who entered the initiative had their phones confiscated, their signatures taken, and a folder opened in their name. He looked down. His voice cracked slightly for the first time. We don't know how many of them are okay. Some dropped out of the industry entirely. A few left cryptic posts online before vanishing. And a couple can no longer be found. A wave of horror swept through the gallery. It was more than exploitation, Monroe said. It was a system, built on fear, managed with precision, and hidden behind the illusion of mentorship. The courtroom was still, not because people didn't have questions, but because no one knew how to ask them anymore. And Diddy? He didn't move. His jaw was clenched, his eyes lowered, his image shattered in a way that couldn't be photoshopped or edited. Agent Monroe closed his folder. We've only begun to scratch the surface, but one thing is certain. This wasn't about protecting a brand. This was about controlling an industry, one secret, one silence, one soul at a time. And as the courtroom sat there, wrapped in disbelief and dread, it became clear. The vault wasn't just a collection of files, it was a mirror, and no one liked what they saw inside. Agent Monroe sat motionless for a moment, letting the weight of his last words hang in the air. He scanned the room, the jury still frozen, the press stunned, Diddy like a statue carved from guilt and pride, refusing to flinch but clearly unraveling inside. And then, with quiet authority, Monroe resumed. There was one room we didn't expect to find. Whispers returned instantly, but this time quieter, more afraid. We found it only after we noticed inconsistencies in the architectural blueprints. Beneath the main vault chamber was a sealed sublevel. No doors, no access point visible. We brought in ground-penetrating radar and discovered a concealed stairwell behind the concrete. It took hours to breach it. A few jurors exchanged shocked glances. One shook their head, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of it. We called it Sub-Zero, Monroe continued. That's what was labeled on a steel panel mounted near the stairbase. Inside that space, we found something unlike anything else on the property. He stopped to collect himself. It was a vault within a vault, but this one wasn't for storing files or money. It was for storage of something else entirely. Tools of intimidation. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, signaling for him to elaborate. There were mannequins, yes, mannequins, dressed in replica clothing of real artists, life-size prints of people's homes, blueprint diagrams of recording studios, simulations, scripts, rehearsed conversations. It looked like role play, but for manipulation. We don't fully understand it yet, but it appeared to be a psychological training room. A quiet Jesus Christ escaped from the back of the room. And it gets darker, Monroe said, his tone now solemn. There was a projector setup playing loops of past encounters, recordings, interviews, performances, all of them dissected and marked with notations like leverage point, emotional weakness, and trigger phrase. Diddy was studying people like assets, not just to silence them, but to break them. The room felt like it was closing in on itself. The assistant district attorney sat with his hand covering his mouth, visibly disturbed. And on the far wall, Monroe said, there were photos, black and white, some faces scratched out, some circled, dozens of them. Every single one had a date underneath. Some of those dates matched incidents, overdoses, breakdowns, mysterious contract cancellations. The judge leaned forward, not to interrupt, but because he physically couldn't look away. We don't yet know what all the dates mean, Monroe admitted, but in several cases we found a direct correlation between someone challenging Diddy publicly and a personal or professional catastrophe days later. He looked directly at the jury. It wasn't coincidence. He flipped to another page of his testimony. There was one final object found in that room, a notebook, handwritten in red ink, dozens of entries, rants, paranoia, planning, but one sentence repeated over and over again. He read it aloud. If I control what they fear, I control who they are. A tremor ran through the room. That sentence was written 63 times, Monroe added, like a mantra, like a blueprint, like a confession. At that moment, the illusion of the pop culture titan, the business mogul, the untouchable icon, all of it seemed to collapse in the courtroom's collective mind. The image of Diddy wasn't just cracked, it had shattered. And still he hadn't spoken. He hadn't denied. He hadn't looked at anyone. Monroe closed his binder. We are still decoding what we found, but we are no longer dealing with a man simply accused of wrongdoing. We are dealing with someone who engineered silence, curated submission, and weaponized influence for years, maybe decades. A tear rolled down the cheek of one juror. We've seen vaults before, Monroe concluded, but never one designed to bury the truth so deep that no one would ever dare to dig. But they had dug, and now that it had been unearthed, there was no going back. Not for Diddy, not for the courtroom, not for the world that once called him untouchable. The silence in the courtroom had become a presence of its own, a ghost settling over every shoulder. Every eye was still locked on Agent Monroe, but it was clear the weight of what had been exposed was pressing harder with every word. And then, as if the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, Monroe spoke again, quieter this time. We reached the turning point of this investigation when we unlocked the final encrypted folder inside the main vault. He paused, not for effect, but because the next statement would alter the course of the trial and the entire narrative around Sean Diddy Combs, forever. The folder was titled Icarus. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even Diddy's own attorneys looked up from their notes. Icarus, Monroe repeated, contained just one file, a video, roughly 27 minutes in length, time-stamped 2 years ago. No edits, no effects, just raw, unfiltered truth. The prosecutor stepped closer to the witness stand. And what was on that video? Agent Monroe looked him dead in the eye. A confession. The entire courtroom collectively stopped breathing. Monroe nodded slowly, letting the gravity of that single word sink into every heart in the room. It was filmed in what appears to be a private recording booth. Single camera angle. Diddy is alone. No music, no entourage. Just him. He starts by pacing. He looks anxious, sweating, talking to himself. At first it seems like a breakdown. Then he sits, looks into the lens and says, Monroe opened his notes, voice unwavering now. You think I didn't plan for this? You think I don't know the game? I've seen men rise and fall. I've made men rise and fall. They all think they're free, but I write the script. Jurors sat stunned, absorbing every syllable. He goes on to name people, dozens of them, celebrities, executives, artists. He explains how he manipulated them, threatened them, recorded them. He admits to ordering the surveillance systems. He speaks of orchestrating smear campaigns. But the part that shook our entire agency, Monroe said, gripping the edge of the witness box, was the final minute. He looked directly at the jury now. He smiles at the camera and says, even if they come for me, they won't believe it. They'll say I was just venting, just acting, and maybe I am, or maybe I'm the reason none of them ever speak. Doesn't matter. The vault holds the truth, and no one's got the balls to open it. Monroe paused as the room rippled with quiet gasps and shaking heads. We opened it, he said, and now the world has heard him say in his own words, without pressure, without manipulation, who he really is. Not the mogul, not the entertainer, but the architect of fear. Even the judge looked shaken now, his gavel untouched, his eyes heavy. The prosecutor turned to the jury. Agent Monroe, was this video authenticated? Yes, the digital forensics team verified its origin, timestamp, and unaltered state. It is real, and it is damning. Diddy sat utterly still, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. His empire had been built on controlling the story. But this wasn't a headline. This was a confession wrapped in arrogance. A vault not just of secrets, but of ego. Monroe's voice lowered, as if speaking directly to the souls of those listening. This wasn't just evidence. This was prophecy. He believed no one would find it, that no one would dare. But here we are, and now that his words are no longer hidden, his truth belongs to everyone. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed the reading of Diddy's private admission was more deafening than any scream. The turning point had come, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The courtroom no longer felt like a place for trial. It felt like the burial ground of a legacy. Sean Diddy Combs, once a symbol of power, success, and untouchable celebrity, now sat in the shadows of his own confession. What began as whispers, as allegations dismissed by PR teams and buried beneath gold records and flashing lights, had now been spoken aloud under oath, under law, and under the eye of the world. Agent Monroe stepped down from the stand. His testimony had ended, but its weight hung like smoke in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to breathe through. The judge called for a short recess, but no one moved. Not the jury, not the press, not the audience. It was as if time had stopped to make room for the truth that had been caged for far too long. Diddy sat motionless, staring into a void that had once been his kingdom. The vault was no longer hidden. It had been pried open piece by piece, file by file, until the image of the man was stripped down to bone and motive. He had built an empire not just with talent, but with fear. Not just with vision, but with silence. Now that silence had turned on him. Across the gallery, victims sat watching, some in tears, some in disbelief, some finally breathing freely for the first time in years. They weren't footnotes anymore. They were witnesses to the fall. When court resumed, the lead prosecutor stood slowly. Her voice was calm, but there was thunder behind it. Your Honor, she said, we have no further questions. The evidence has spoken. The vault has spoken. Mr. Combs has spoken. For himself. And he had, in his own words, on his own recordings, his own handwriting. No one twisted his truth. He laid it bare in that hidden room, never believing anyone would ever be bold enough to reveal it. The defense team declined to present a rebuttal. Their faces told the story. The damage was beyond repair. There was no spin, no doubt to cast, no witness that could unwrite what the world now knew. Then came the closing moment. The judge looked out over the courtroom, his voice firm but heavy. This court has been presented with overwhelming evidence, gathered through lawful means, and validated beyond dispute. The scale and intent of what has been revealed here go far beyond this room, far beyond one individual. He turned his gaze toward Diddy. Mr. Combs, you are not here because of your fame. You are here because of your actions. And no amount of power, status, or fortune can shield any person from accountability when that power is built on the destruction of others. A quiet ripple of emotion moved through the gallery. Not triumph, not celebration, something quieter, something more sacred, justice. Outside, the media swarmed, but inside there was no sound but the final gavel. It didn't slam, it struck with precision, a closing note to years of unanswered questions, a symphony of silence finally ending. And as Diddy was escorted out, the man who once ruled red carpets with swagger and a smile left the room not as a mogul, but as a man unmasked. The vault was open, and now so was the truth.